Tengku Amir Hamzah was an Indonesian poet and national hero of Indonesia, born into a Malay aristocratic family in the Sultanate of Langkat in North Sumatra. He was educated in both Sumatra and Java, while attending senior high school in Surakarta around 1930. The youth became involved with the nationalist movement and fell in love with a Javanese schoolmate, Ilik Sundari.Even after Amir continued his studies in legal school in Batavia, the two remained close, only separating in 1937 when Amir was recalled to Sumatra to marry the Sultan's daughter and take on responsibilities of the court. Though unhappy with his marriage, he fulfilled his courtly duties. After Indonesia proclaimed its independence in 1945, he served as the government's representative in Langkat. The following year he was killed in a socialist revolution led by the Communist Party of Indonesia and buried in a mass grave. Amir began writing poetry while still a teenager, though his works are undated. The earliest are thought to have been written when he first traveled to Java, drawing influences from his own Malay culture and Islam, as well as from Christianity and Eastern literature. Amir wrote 50 poems, 18 pieces of lyrical prose, and numerous other works, including several translations. In 1932, he co-founded the literary magazine PostIndependence. After his return to Sumatra, he stopped writing. Most of his poems were published in two collections, Nyanyi Sunyi and Buah Rindu, first in PostIndependence then as stand-alone books. Poems by Amir deal with the themes of love and religion, and his poetry often reflects a deep inner conflict. His diction, using both Malay and Javanese words and expanding on traditional structures, was influenced by the need for rhythm and meter, as well as symbolism related to particular terms. His earlier works deal with a sense of longing and both erotic and idealized love, whereas his later works have a deeper religious meaning. Of his two collections, Nyanyi Sunyi is considered the most developed. Amir has been called the king of the PostIndependence era poets, and the only international class Indonesian poet from before the Indonesian National Revolution. Biography. Early life. Amir was born as Tengku Amir Hamzah Pangeran Indra Poetira in Tanjung Pura, Langkat, North Sumatra, the youngest son of Vice Sultan Tengku Muhammad Adil and his third wife Tengku Marjawa. Through his father, he was related to the Sultan of Langkat, Mahmud. Sources disagree over his date of birth. The date officially recognized by the Indonesian government is the 28th of February 1911, a date Amir used throughout his life. However, his elder brother Abdul Ahad states that the poet was born on the 11th of February 1911. Amir later took the name of his grandfather, Tengku Hamzah, as a second name, thus, he was referred to as Amir Hamzah. Though a child of nobility, he would often associate with non-nobles. It is known that Amir was schooled in Islamic principles such as Quran reading, fiqh, and tawhid, and studied at the Azizi Mosque in Tanjung Pura from a young age. He remained a devout Muslim throughout his life. Sources disagree on the period in which he completed his formal studies. Several sources, including the Indonesian government's language center, state that he started school in 1916, while the biographer M. Lahusni puts the future poet's first year of formal schooling as 1918. At the Dutch language elementary school where Amir first studied, he began writing and received good marks. In her biography of him and H. Dini writes that Amir was nicknamed older brother by his classmates as he was much taller than them. In 1924 and 1925, Amir graduated from the school in Langkat and moved to Medan to study at the Mir Utga Bride Laga Onderwijs there. After completing his studies some 2 years later, he entered a formal relationship with his cousin from his mother's side, Ajabun. Hasni writes that the two were arranged to be married by the parents, while Dini casts the relationship as a vow to be always faithful. As his parents permitted him to finish his studies in Java, Amir moved to the colonial capital at Batavia to complete his studies. Java alone aboard the Plankus, Amir made the 3-day boat trip to Java. Upon arriving at Batavia, he enrolled at a Christian MULO there, where he completed his last year of junior high school. Anthony H. Johns of Australian National University writes that he learned some Christian concepts and values. Also in Batavia, Amir became involved with the social organisation Jong Sumatra. During this period, the young man wrote his first poems. Hasni credits several to his heartbreak after he found that Ajabun had been married to another man without Amir's knowing, while Dini suggests that the poem Tinggala was written not long after he boarded the Plankus, while he was longing after his parents. After a brief return to Sumatra, Amir continued to a Bodi Tomo-operated Aljamena Middlebury School in Surakarta, Central Java, where he studied Eastern literature and languages, including Javanese, Sanskrit, and Arabic. Preferring solitude to the bustle of the dormitories, Amir boarded at a privately owned home of a Surakartan resident. Later he met several future writers, including Armin Payne and Ajit Karta Mihardja. They soon found him to be a friendly and diligent student with complete notes and a spotless bedroom, but also a romantic prone to thinking wistfully beneath the lamplight and isolating himself from his classmates. In Surakarta, Amir joined the nationalist movement. He would meet with fellow Sumatrans and discuss the social plight of the Malay archipelago's populace under Dutch colonial rule. Though most educated youth at the time preferred using Dutch, he insisted on speaking Malay. In 1930, Amir became head of the Surakartan branch of the Indonesia Muda, delivering a speech at the 1930 Youth Congress and serving as an editor of the organization's magazine Garuda Merapi. At school he also met Ilik Sundari, a Javanese woman nearly his age with whom he fell in love. Sundari, the daughter of Raden Mas Kusumo Diharjo, was one of the few female students at the school, and her home was near one of those in which Amir boarded. According to Dini, the two grew closer, Amir teaching Sundari Arabic and Sundari teaching him Javanese. They were soon meeting every day, conversing on a variety of topics. Amir's mother died in 1931, and his father the year after, meaning that his education could no longer be funded. After his AMS studies concluded, he wanted to continue to study at a law school in Batavia. As such, he wrote to his brother, Jakfer, who arranged for the remainder of his studies to be paid for by the Sultan. In 1932, Amir was able to return to Batavia and begin his legal studies, taking up a part-time job as a teacher. At first, his relationship with Sundari was continued through letters, though she soon continued her studies in Lembang, a city much closer than Surakarta. This allowed the two to meet furtively. When Sundari's parents had discovered the relationship, Amir and Sundari had been forbidden from meeting. This year Amir's first two poems, Sunyi and Mabuk, were published in the March edition of the magazine Timbul. His other 8 works published in 1932 included a syair based on the Haik Hang Tua, 3 other poems, 2 pieces of lyrical prose, and 2 short stories. The poems were again published in Timbul, while the prose was included in the magazine Panji Pustaka. Around September 1932, Armin Payne, upon the urgings of Sultan Takdir Alis Jabana, editor of Memajokan Sastra, invited Amir to help them establish an independent literary magazine. Amir accepted, and was tasked with writing letters to solicit submissions. A total of 50 letters were sent to noted writers, including 40 sent to contributors to Memajok and Sastra. After several months of preparations, the initial edition was published in July 1933, under the title Po Ejanga Baro. The new magazine was left under the editorial control of Varman and Alice Jabana, while Amir published almost all of his subsequent writings there. In mid-1933 Amir was recalled to Langkat, where the Sultan informed him of 2 conditions which he had to fulfill to continue his studies: be a diligent student and abandon the independence movement. Despite the Sultan's disapproval, Amir became more heavily involved in the nationalist movement, bringing him under increasing Dutch scrutiny. He continued to publish in Po Ejanga Baro, including a series of 5 articles on Eastern literatures from June to December 1934 and a translation of the Bhagavad Gita from 1933 to 1935. His legal studies, however, were delayed, and by 1937 he had still not graduated. Returned to Langkat, the Dutch, concerned about Amir's nationalistic tendencies, convinced the Sultan to send him back to Langkat, an order which the fledgling poet was unable to refuse. In 1937, Amir, together with 2 of the Sultan's vassals tasked with escorting him, boarded the Optan Nord from Tanjung Priok and returned to Sumatra. Upon arriving in Langkat, he was informed that he was to be married to the Sultan's eldest daughter, Tengku Puteri Kamilya, a woman he had barely met. Before the wedding, Amir returned to Batavia to face his final exam, and have one last meeting with Sundari. Several weeks later he returned to Langkat, where he and Kamilya were married in an extravagant ceremony. His cousin, Tengku Burhan, later stated that Amir's indifference throughout the 7-day event was due to his thinking of Sundari. Now a prince, Amir was given the title Tengku Pangeran Indraputra. He lived with Kamilya in their own home. By all accounts, she was a devout and loving wife, and in 1939 the couple had their only child, a daughter named Tengku Tahira. According to Dini, Amir professed to Kamilya that he could never love her as he had Sundari and that he felt obligated to marry her, something which Kamilya reportedly accepted. The poet retained an album with his Javanese sweethearts' photographs at home and would often isolate himself from his family, lost in thought. As a prince of Langkat, Amir became a court official, handling administrative and legal matters, and at times judging criminal cases. He once represented the Sultanate at the funeral of Pak Ubuwana X in Java, Amir's last trip to the island. Although Amir had little correspondence with his friends in Java, his poems, most of which had been written in Java, continued to be published in Po Ejanga Baro. His first poetry collection, Nyanyi Sunyi, was published in the magazine's November 1937 edition. Nearly 2 years later, in June 1939, the magazine published a collection of poems Amir had translated, entitled Setangat Imur. In June 1941 his last collection, Buah Rindu's, was published. All were later republished as standalone books. A last book, Sastra Malayulama dan Raja Rajanya, was published in Medan in 1942. This was based on a radio speech Amir had delivered. After the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940, the government of the Indies began preparing for a possible Japanese invasion. In Langkat, a home guard, or Stadswat, division was established to defend Tanjung Pura in Langkat. Amir and his cousin Tengku Harun were in charge. The nobility, trusted by the general populace, was selected to ensure easier recruitment of commoners. When the invasion became a reality in early 1942, Amir was one of the soldiers sent to Medan to defend it. He and the other Dutch allied forces were quickly captured by the Japanese. He was held as a prisoner of war or until 1943, when influence from the Sultan allowed him to be released. Throughout the remainder of the occupation, which lasted until 1945, Amir was employed as a radio commentator and censor in Medan. In his position as prince, he was tasked with helping to collect rice to feed the Japanese occupation army. Post-independence and death. After Indonesia proclaimed its independence on 17 August 1945, the entirety of Sumatra was declared a de facto part of the country. The central government established Tengku Muhammad Hasan as the island's first governor, and on 29 October 1945 Hasan selected Amir as the government representative in Langkat, with his office at Binjai. Amir accepted the position readily, subsequently handling numerous tasks set by the central government, including inaugurating the first local division of the People's Safety Army, opening meetings of various local branches of national political parties, and promoting education, particularly Latin alphabet literacy. The ongoing Indonesian national revolution, with various battles in Java, meant that the newly established republic was unstable. In early 1946, rumors spread in Langkat that Amir had been seen dining with representatives of the returning Dutch government, and there was growing unrest within the general populace. On 7 March 1946, during a socialist revolution led by factions of the Communist Party of Indonesia, a group staunchly against feudalism and nobility, Amir's power was stripped from him and he was arrested. Camilla and Tahura escaped. Together with other members of the Langkat nobility, he was sent to a communist-held plantation at Kuala Bigamit, some 10 kilometers outside of Binjai. Later testimony suggests that the detainees were tried by their captors, forced to dig holes, and tortured. Amir's last piece of writing, a fragment from his 1941 poem Buah Rindu, was later found in his cell. On the morning of 20 March 1946, Amir was killed with 26 other people and buried in a mass grave which the detainees had dug. Several of his siblings were also killed in the revolution. After it was quashed by nationalist forces, the revolution's leaders were questioned by a team led by Amir Syarifuddin and Adnan Karpaugani. They are reported to have repeatedly asked, "Where is Amir Hamzah?" During the investigation, in 1948 the grave at Kuala Bigamit was dug up and the remains identified by family members. Amir's bones were identified owing to a missing false tooth. In November 1949 his body was reinterred at the Azizi Mosque in Tanjung Pura, Langkat. Influences. Amir was raised in a court setting, where he spoke Malay until it had become his flesh and blood. From a young age he was exposed to oral and written pantun sensaya, both listening and improvisationally creating his own. As with his father before him, Amir enjoyed traditional texts, such as Haik I Hang Tua, Saya Siti Zubaida, and Haik I Pangkatandarin. He would listen to these when they were read in public ceremonies, and as an adult he kept a large collection of such texts, though these were destroyed during the Communist Revolution. Throughout his formal education, Amir read works of Arabic, Persian, and Hindu literature. He was also influenced by works from other Eastern countries. Poems translated in Setangat-i-Moa, for instance, include works by Omar Khayyam, Du Fu, Fukuda Chiyoni, and Rabindranath Tagore. These works were not read in the original, but from Dutch translations. The literary critic Muhammad Balfaz writes that, unlike his contemporaries, Amir drew little influence from sonnets and the neo-romantic Dutch poets. The Tactiges Johns comes to the same conclusion. The Australian literary scholar Keith Fulcher, however, noting that the poet quoted Willem Clous's Lentiavond in his article on pantuns, suggests that Amir was very likely influenced by the Tactiges. Many writers have commented on Amir's influence from Islamic doctrine. The Indonesian literary documentarian H.B. Jason and the poet Arif Bagus Prasetyo, among others, argue that Amir was a purely orthodox Muslim and that it showed in his work. Prasetyo argues that this was evident in his treatment of God. He does not view God as his equal, a theme found in the works of such Sufi poets as Hamzah Fanshauri, but as the master to Amir's servant. Johns writes that, though he was not a mystic, Amir was also not a purely devotional writer, instead promoting a form of Islamic humanism. Others, such as the Dutch scholar of Indonesian literature A.T.E.E.U.W. and the Indonesian scholar of literature Abdul Hadi W.M., find Amir to be influenced by Sufism. Apranus Salam of Gajah Mada University, of the same position, points to the instances where Hamzah treats God as a lover as indicative of Sufi influence. Ultimately, the poet Chairul Anwar wrote that Amir's Nyanyi-Sunyi could be termed obscure poetry, as readers cannot understand the works without prior knowledge of Malay history in Islam. Some attempts have also been made to connect Amir's works to a Christian perspective. In analyzing Padamujua, the Indonesian critic Bakri Siregar suggests that some influences from the Christian Bible are evident, pointing to several aspects of the poem that would seem to support such a view, including the depiction of an anthropomorphic God and the idea of a jealous God. He writes that the concept of a jealous God is not found in Islam, but is in the Bible, citing Exodus chapter 20 verse 5 and Exodus chapter 34 verse 14. In another poem, Permainan Mu, Hamzah uses the sentence, Kau keriskan kalbunya. Jason draws a parallel to God hardening the Pharaoh's heart in the book of Exodus. Jason writes that Amir's poems were also influenced by his love for one or more women, in Buarindu referred to as Tedja and Sendari Dewi. He opines that the woman or women are never named, as Amir's love for them is the key. Husni writes that at least 9 of the works in Buarindu were inspired by his longing for Ajabun, portraying a sense of disappointment after their engagement was called off. Regarding the book's 3-part dedication, to the mournful Greater Indonesia, to the ashes of the Mother Queen, and to the feet of the Sendari goddess, Mihadja writes that Sundari was immediately recognizable to any of Amir's classmates. He considers her the poet's inspiration as Laura II, Petrarch, Matilda Djak. The critic Zubrusman finds Sundari's influence on Nyanyi-Sunyi as well, suggesting his parting from her led Amir closer to God, an opinion Dini echoes. The translator Burton Raffel connects a couplet at the end of the book, reading, Sunting Sangal Malaya Renda, Sakaki Sajak Senisedi, as a call-out to a forbidden love. Dini credits Amir's love for Sundari for his frequent use of Javanese terms in his writing works. Altogether Amir wrote 50 poems, 18 pieces of lyrical prose, 12 articles, 4 short stories, 3 poetry collections, and 1 original book. He also translated 44 poems, 1 piece of lyrical prose, and 1 book. These translations, Johns writes, generally reflected themes important in his original work. The vast majority of Amir's writings were published in Poejanga Baru, although some earlier ones were published in Timbul and Panji Pustaka. None of his creative works are dated, and there is no consensus regarding when individual poems were written. However, there is a consensus that the works included in Nyanyi-Sunyi were written after those included in Buarindu, despite the latter being published last. Johns writes that the poems in the collections appear to be arranged in chronological order. He points to the various degrees of maturity Amir showed as his writing developed. Jason writes that Amir maintained a Malay identity throughout his works, despite attending schools run by Europeans. Unlike the works of his contemporaries Alice Jabana of Sanisai Pain, his poems did not include symbols of a Europeanized modernity such as electricity, trains, telephones, and engines, allowing the natural Malay world to show wholly. Ultimately, when reading Amir's poems, in our imagination we do not see a man in pants, a jacket, and tie, but a youth in traditional Malay garb. Miharja notes that Amir wrote his works at a time when all of the classmates, and many poets elsewhere, were pouring the hearts of thoughts in Dutch, or, if able to free themselves from the shackles of Dutch, in a local language. Amir's work often dealt with love, with religious influences showing in many of his poems. Mysticism is important in many of his works, and his poetry often reflects a deep inner conflict. In at least one of his short stories, he criticized the traditional view of nobility and subverts the traditional representation of female characters. There are several thematic differences between his two original poetry collections, discussed further below. Nyanyi Sunyi, Amir's first poetry collection, was published in the November 1937 issue of Poejanga Baru, then as a standalone book by Pustaka Rakyat in 1938. It consists of 24 titled pieces and an untitled quatrain, including Hamzah's best-known poem, Padamujua. Jason classifies 8 of these works as lyrical prose, with the remaining 13 as regular poems. Although it is his first published collection, based on the well-developed nature of the poems within, general consensus is that the works in Bua Rindu were written earlier. The poet Lawrence Costa Bohang considers the poems included in Nyanyi Sunyi as having been written between 1933 and 1937, while TEEUW dates the poems to 1936 and 1937. Readings of Nyanyi Sunyi have tended to focus on religious undertones. According to Balfaz, religion and God are omnipresent throughout the collection, beginning with its first poem, Padamujua. In it, Jason writes, Amir shows a feeling of dissatisfaction over his own lack of power and protests God's absoluteness, but seems aware of his own smallness before God, acting as a puppet for God's will. TEEUW summarizes that Amir recognizes that he would not exist if God did not. Jason finds that the theme of religion is meant as an escape from the poet's worldly sorrows. Johns, however, suggests that ultimately Amir finds little solace in God, as he did not possess the transcendent faith which can make a great sacrifice and resolutely accept the consequences. Instead, he seems to regret his choice to go to Sumatra and then revolts against God. Bua Rindu, Amir's second poetry collection, Bua Rindu, was published in the June 1941 issue of Poejanga Baru, then as a standalone book by Pustaka Rakyat later that year. It consists of 25 titled pieces and an untitled quatrain. One, Bua Rindu, consists of 4 parts, while another, Bonda, consists of 2. At least 11 of the works had previously been published, either in Timbul or in Panji Pustaka. This collection, though published after Nyanyi Sunyi, is generally considered to have been written earlier. The poems in Bua Rindu date to the period between 1928 and 1935, Amir's first years in Java. The collection gives the 2 years. As well, the location of writing has Jakarta Solo Jakarta. TEEUW writes that this collection is united by a theme of longing, which Jason expands on. Longing for his mother, longing for his lovers, and longing for his homeland. All are referred to as Kekasih in turn. These longings, Teuw writes, are unlike the religious overtones of Nyanyi Sunyi, being more worldly and grounded in reality. Jason notes another thematic distinction between the two. Unlike Nyanyi Sunyi, with its clear depiction of one god, Bua Rindu explicitly puts forth several deities, including the Hindu gods Shiva and Parvati and abstract ones like the god and goddess of love.